Celestial War Series, The Architecture of Grace. Chapter 1, The Harvest. The viewing aperture was Raziel's favorite instrument in the lower terrace. It was a disc of polished celestial brass, the width of a dining table, set into a pedestal of white stone at the edge of the observation deck. When activated, the surface of the brass became perfectly transparent like a window that looked straight down through the barrier between realms, offering an unobstructed view of the human realm below. The resolution was exquisite. Raziel could count the tiles on a rooftop. They could read the lips of a man praying in a field. They could see even the specks of dust below. Raziel leaned over the aperture, their hands resting lightly on the brass rim, and studied the city of Ashenmere. The drought had entered its third month. The river that bisected the city had retreated to a sluggish brown thread in a cracked, white bed. The agricultural terraces surrounding the walls had gone from gold to tan to the pale, brittle yellow of dying grain. The reservoir on the eastern hill was visible as a dark stain at the bottom of an empty stone basin, the waterline rings marking each week of decline like growth rings on a severed tree. Raziel tilted the aperture slightly, adjusting the focal depth. The city's central square came into focus. A crowd had gathered around the municipal well. The well keeper was rationing, 2 clay cups per family, enforced by a thin line of city guards whose uniforms were dark with sweat. A woman near the front of the line was holding a baby against her hip, the infant's cries thin and reedy in the dry air. An elderly man sat against the base of the well wall, his head bowed, his lips moving, praying. Raziel straightened up and opened the leather ledger resting on the pedestal beside the aperture. The ledger was a beautiful object with a celestial vellum bound in white calfskin, the pages inscribed with columns of luminous golden script that shifted and updated in real time. It tracked every measurable variable of the Ashenmere engagement: population density, mortality rate, median prayer frequency, and the critical metric at the bottom of every page, the aggregate faith output, expressed in standard units of celestial capital. The number had been climbing for 11 days. Raziel traced the curve with their fingertip, feeling the warmth of the golden ink against their skin. The trajectory was textbook. Desperation followed a predictable logarithmic curve, slow at first, then accelerating sharply once the population crossed the subsistence threshold. Ashenmere had crossed it 6 days ago. The prayer frequency had tripled. The qualitative intensity, the raw, desperate fervor of each individual plea had increased by a factor they hadn't seen since the Meridian famine 2 centuries prior. Today was the peak. Raziel could feel it in the numbers the way a musician feels the resolution of a chord. 1 more day and the mortality rate would begin to erode the population base. 2 more days and the surviving humans would transition from desperate prayer to resigned silence, the most wasteful state in the entire faith cycle. The window was narrow. The window was now. Raziel closed the ledger, pressed their palm flat against the brass rim of the aperture, and smiled. The air on the lower terrace was still. It was always still. The celestial realm did not have wind. It had light, a pervasive, directionless illumination that came from no source and cast no shadows. The terrace itself was carved from a single block of white stone, so pure it seemed to glow from within. The air smelled of cold ozone and polished metal, the permanent ambient scent of a realm built from materials that had never known decay. Raziel was beautiful. They were always beautiful. It was a professional requirement, not a personal vanity. Today they wore the form of a tall, angular figure with sharp, symmetrical features and eyes the color of molten brass. Their robes were the standard-issue white of an auditor, cut close at the shoulders and flaring at the wrists, with a golden classification sigil embroidered over the sternum. 3rd tier, division of sustenance. Their wings were folded flat against their back, the feathers so tightly compressed they looked like panels of hammered silver. The sound of footsteps on the white stone made Raziel look up. Huriel was crossing the terrace with a sheaf of parchment pressed against their chest. They were younger than Raziel by several centuries, slender, precise, with the immaculate posture and faintly anxious expression of a junior clerk who had been promoted too quickly and was determined to justify the appointment. Their robes bore the simpler sigil of a celestial scribe, and their wings were smaller. the feathers a paler shade of silver that hadn't yet fully hardened into the metallic sheen of maturity. "Auditor," Puriel said, stopping 3 paces from the aperture. They held out the sheaf of parchment. "The quarterly yield report from the eastern reaches." Raziel took the parchment and scanned it. The golden script was dense with figures. Their eyes moved to the bottom line and stopped. "We lost 11% in the eastern sector," Raziel said. They didn't raise their voice. They turned the parchment around and held it up for Puriel to see, tapping the figure with one long finger. 11% of our active faith streams diverted to competitor channels in a single quarter. Explain." Puriel's posture stiffened. "The demons have been running targeted interventions in the rural provinces. Small-scale weather manipulation, localized rain, crop recovery, immediate relief. They're offering transactional returns to individual households. The farmers pray to whatever makes the rain come, and the demons are delivering faster than our scheduled miracle cycles." "They're undercutting us," Raziel said. They set the parchment on the pedestal and leaned back against the aperture's rim, folding their arms. "The scribe's office has flagged it as a priority concern," Puriel said. "They're recommending an accelerated intervention schedule for the eastern sector to recapture the diverted streams before the demons consolidate." "No," Raziel said. Puriel stopped. "Let them have the farmers," Raziel said. Puriel's mouth opened slightly. They closed it and recalibrated. "Auditor, if we cede the rural provinces, we lose the agricultural base of the eastern faith stream. The long-term capital projection is irrelevant compared to what happens in Ashenmere today." Raziel turned back to the viewing aperture and gestured for Puriel to approach. "Come here, look." Puriel stepped forward and looked down through the brass disc. The city of Ashenmere spread below them, the cracked riverbed, the dying terraces, the crowd around the rationed well. "What do you see?" Raziel asked. "A population in crisis," Puriel said. "Estimated 72 hours from critical mortality threshold." "What else?" Puriel studied the humans. "Elevated prayer density, concentrated around the central temple district and the municipal water distribution points. Qualitative intensity is significant." "Significant," Raziel repeated, their voice warming. "Puriel, that is a masterpiece. Every soul in that city is praying with the absolute, genuine conviction that their lives depend on divine intervention. Not habit, not ritual, not the empty recitations of a comfortable population that prays because their parents did. These people believe with every fiber of their starving bodies that if the heavens do not open, they will die." Raziel's eyes were bright. "Do you understand what that is worth?" "The yield projections are exceptional," Puriel acknowledged. "Exceptional is an understatement. A comfortable city of this size produces roughly 400 standard units per quarter. Ashenmere, right now, in this window, will produce 1,600 in a single event, 400% return, and the only investment was patience." Puriel looked at the city through the aperture. The woman with the baby was still standing in the water line. The elderly man was still praying against the well wall. "The demons taking the eastern farmers accelerates this," Raziel continued. They picked up the yield report and waved it gently. "Every farmer who defects to a demon's contract is one less soul receiving our aid. That concentrates the remaining population's dependence on the central miracle. The fewer alternatives they have, the harder they pray. The demons aren't stealing our market share, Puriel. They're seasoning our harvest." Puriel's expression was carefully neutral. "The scribe's office may not see it that way." "The scribe's office counts beans. I grow them." Raziel set the report down. "Now, are the moisture reserves loaded?" "The celestial moisture banks were filled to capacity at the start of the quarter per your requisition," Puriel said, consulting a second piece of parchment. "The venting infrastructure is staged at Relay Point 7, directly above the Ashenmere watershed." "Good." Raziel straightened their robes and moved toward the heavy brass valve assembly mounted at the far end of the terrace. The valve was a magnificent piece of engineering. It stood 7 feet tall, a cylindrical column of polished brass fitted with interlocking rings, each inscribed with routing coordinates that directed the flow of celestial moisture through the barrier and into the atmospheric systems of the human realm below. They placed both hands on the primary actuator ring and began the calibration sequence. The brass warmed under their palms, the inscriptions glowing as the routing aligned. Through the aperture behind them, they could see the sky above Ashenmere, cloudless, white, merciless. "Relay 7, Raziel said. "Open the vent at 40% capacity. I want the cloud formation to build for approximately 20 minutes before the first rain. Let them see it coming. Let them watch the sky change. The anticipation amplifies the release." Puriel made a note on their parchment. Duration of the rainfall event: 3 hours, enough to fill the reservoir to functional capacity and saturate the topsoil for a planting cycle. Not enough to resolve the drought entirely. We want them grateful, not comfortable. "Understood," Puriel said. Raziel turned the actuator ring. The brass valve opened with a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the stone of the terrace. Somewhere far above, in the celestial infrastructure that Raziel would never see and didn't particularly care about, vast banks of hoarded atmospheric moisture began to move, flowing through channels and relay points and dimensional barriers with the mechanical precision of a system designed by minds that had been engineering weather for longer than the human species had existed. Through the aperture, the sky above Ashenmere darkened. It happened slowly. A pale haze formed at the western horizon, thickening into a gray mass that spread across the bleached sky with a deliberate, stately momentum. The crowd at the well looked up. The woman with the baby stopped rocking and lifted her face. The elderly man against the wall opened his eyes. The cloud bank deepened. The light changed, from the harsh, flat white of the drought to a softer, bruised gray that made the cracked earth look almost gentle. The air pressure shifted, and Raziel could see it in the way the dust settled in the streets, the way the dead leaves on the ground stopped skittering and went still. The first drop fell. Through the aperture, Raziel watched a single dark spot appear on the pale stone of the well plaza, then another, then a third. The crowd went silent, a held breath, a collective suspension of disbelief. The woman with the baby pressed her hand against the stone and looked at the wet mark on her palm. Then the sky opened. The rain came down in sheets. Heavy, warm, drenching rain that turned the dust to mud in seconds and filled the empty gutters with rushing, brown-white water. The crowd around the well erupted. The sound reached Raziel through the aperture as a distant, layered roar, screaming, weeping, laughing, and beneath it all, the deep, rhythmic chanting of a population dropping to its knees in the mud to give thanks to the heavens that had finally, mercifully answered. The faith capital hit Raziel like a wave breaking against a seawall. It came up through the aperture, through the brass, through the stone of the terrace, a massive, surging column of raw devotional energy that struck their chest and expanded outward through their body. Their skin flushed gold. The feathers of their folded wings vibrated, each one ringing with a high, crystalline tone that filled the terrace with a sound like 1,000 glass bells struck simultaneously. Their vision whited out for a fraction of a second, the sheer volume of concentrated gratitude overloading the sensory channels before the celestial metabolism compensated and began converting the raw input into usable capital. Raziel gripped the brass rim of the valve and breathed. The sensation was extraordinary, a flooding, consuming warmth that tasted of copper and honey and the salt of human tears. Every prayer was distinct. They could feel the individual signatures: the woman with the baby, the old man at the well, the guard who had been rationing water and was now standing in the rain with his arms open and his face turned to the sky. 1642, Puriel said from behind them, reading the ledger. Their voice was professionally steady, but Raziel could hear the slight elevation in pitch that meant the scribe was impressed despite their best efforts. Standard units. The quarterly quota for this sector is met. Raziel released the valve. The rain would continue on its own for the programmed 3 hours. They turned away from the aperture and opened their eyes. The golden flush was fading from their skin, settling into the deeper reserves where the capital would be stored and allocated according to the division's operating budget. Met, Raziel said. They picked up the ledger and made a notation in the margin, a small, elegant symbol that indicated a successful harvest. But not sufficient. Puriel looked up from the parchment. The quota is fulfilled, auditor. The quota is a floor, not a ceiling. Raziel closed the ledger and tucked it under their arm. They looked out over the terrace, past the aperture, toward the vast, luminous expanse of the celestial realm stretching above them, tier upon tier of white stone and golden light, rising toward the high council chambers that even a third-tier auditor had never been permitted to enter. The war is consuming capital faster than we can harvest it. The demon front has expanded into 3 new sectors this quarter alone. The vanguard is requesting double allocations for the spring offensive. They turned back to Puriel. We need a better source, something that doesn't depend on weather patterns and human mortality curves, something more fundamental. Puriel held their parchment against their chest. What did you have in mind? Raziel looked at the aperture. The rain was still falling on Ashenmere. The prayers were still rising. I'm not sure yet, Raziel said. They smiled. But I have a theory I'd like to test. They walked off the terrace, their silver wings catching the directionless light, their boots striking the white stone with measured, confident rhythm. Welcome to the Portal Library. Step through and let the magic begin. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment if you'd love more stories or have a request. We have a Patreon where you can support the story production directly or to follow for free and stay up to date with new story drafts notifications. The link will be included in the description below. New videos are uploaded on YouTube every Monday. Celestial War Series, The Architecture of Grace, an epic fantasy story. Chapter 2, The Calculus of the Soul. Raziel's laboratory occupied a sealed chamber in the administrative substructure of the 3rd tier, a space that had been designed as a records archive and repurposed, with the quiet bureaucratic persistence that Raziel had perfected over centuries, into something considerably more interesting. The room was perfectly symmetrical. White stone walls rose to a vaulted ceiling inlaid with geometric patterns of gold and silver that served no decorative purpose. They were resonance channels designed to contain and redirect celestial energy within the chamber. The floor was polished to a reflective sheen. A long workbench of white marble ran the length of the eastern wall, its surface covered with instruments arranged in precise, parallel rows. Calibration lenses, harmonic tuning forks, spectral analysis plates, and a set of celestial scalpels stored in a velvet-lined case that Raziel had commissioned from the finest artificer in the 2nd tier. At the center of the room, a massive clock was mounted on the southern wall. It was not a human clock. It did not measure hours or minutes. It measured the oscillation rate of the celestial barrier, the membrane that separated the realm of the divine from the gray silence of the spirit realm below. The pendulum swung in a slow, heavy arc, each tick resonating through the stone floor with a deep, subsonic vibration that Raziel felt in the bones of their feet. It was the heartbeat of the boundary between the living and the dead. Raziel stood at the workbench, examining a glass containment sphere the size of a human fist. Inside the sphere, a human spirit drifted. It was a small, gray, translucent thing, a soft-edged cloud of luminescent mist that pulsed with a faint, irregular rhythm. It had been confiscated 3 weeks ago during a routine interdiction of a minor demon supply line. The demons had been transporting a cache of harvested spirits for their own crude energy extraction, and the Vanguard Patrol had seized the cargo before the demons could process it. Most of the spirits had been logged, cataloged, and sent to the disposition office for standard release back into the spirit realm. Raziel had kept one. They held the sphere up to the directionless light, turning it slowly. The spirit inside shifted, its luminescence brightening and dimming in response to the movement. It was unremarkable, a mid-density soul, probably a human who had died of natural causes within the last century. The standard metrics were average. Residual identity coherence, moderate. Memory saturation, typical. Emotional charge, baseline. Raziel set the sphere down and opened their ledger. The numbers were the problem. They had been the problem for decades, and the Ashenmere harvest, spectacular as it was, had only worsened the math. Faith capital was a renewable resource, but it renewed on human timelines, not celestial ones. Humans prayed when they suffered. They stopped praying when they were comfortable. They died and were replaced by children who inherited their parents' gods or abandoned them entirely. The entire celestial economy was built on the emotional output of a species with a 70-year lifespan and an attention span considerably shorter. The war changed the equation. The demon conflict had been grinding through its 4th century, and the vanguard's appetite for capital was accelerating. Every maneuver required more capital. The High Council had increased the quarterly quota 3 times in the last decade, and the auditors were running out of droughts, plagues, and miracles to engineer. The humans were being squeezed dry. Raziel tapped their finger against the ledger's margin, a habit they'd developed over centuries of working through logistics problems. The living humans were a bottleneck. Their faith was powerful but inefficient, diluted by doubt, interrupted by sleep, extinguished by death. What Raziel needed was a source that didn't depend on the fragile, unreliable machinery of human consciousness. They looked at the spirit in the glass sphere. A spirit was the distilled essence of a human life, stripped of the body, stripped of the biological noise, reduced to its fundamental components: memory, identity, and the emotional charge that bound the two together. It was, in a purely theoretical sense, a concentrated battery of exactly the energy that faith was a diluted expression of. The question was whether that battery could be cracked open. The barrier clock ticked, the pendulum swung. Raziel picked up the sphere and carried it to the geometric altar at the center of the room. The altar was a disk of white stone 3 feet in diameter, inscribed with concentric rings of containment script that glowed with a faint, steady golden light. It was designed to hold celestial materials during analysis, a standard piece of laboratory equipment, rated for moderate energy loads. Raziel had reinforced it twice in the last week, adding additional containment rings and anchoring the base to the resonance channels in the walls as precaution. They were placing the glass sphere at the center of the altar when the laboratory door opened. The light in the room changed. It intensified, not gradually, but in a single, crushing expansion that pressed against Raziel's skin and made the instruments on the workbench ring faintly in their cases. The air thickened. The temperature dropped. The barrier clock's pendulum slowed by a fraction of a degree, as if the mechanism itself was deferring to the presence that had just entered. Archangel Michael filled the doorway the way a thunderstorm fills a valley. He was enormous, not physically larger than Raziel, though he was taller by a full head, but dimensionally heavier, as if the space around him was being compressed by the sheer density of celestial authority packed into his form. His armor was white gold, seamless, inscribed with battle scripture that crawled across the surface in constantly shifting patterns. His wings were fully extended, 6 of them, layered in descending pairs, each feather burning with a soft, steady white fire that cast no shadows but made every surface in the laboratory look slightly less real by comparison. His face was beautiful in the way that a glacier is beautiful, ancient, symmetrical, and entirely indifferent to the existence of anything smaller than itself. "Auditor Raziel," Michael said. His voice didn't echo. It occupied the room, filling every corner simultaneously, as if the stone itself was speaking. "You were not scheduled for a facility review." "Eminence," Raziel said. They inclined their head, the precise degree of deference required by protocol, not a fraction more. "I wasn't aware the Vanguard Command conducted facility reviews of 3rd-tier administrative archives." "They don't," Michael said. He stepped into the laboratory, his burning wings folding partially to clear the doorframe. His eyes, white, pupilless, radiating a light that made Raziel's skin itch, swept across the workbench, the instruments, the reinforced altar, and the glass sphere resting at its center. "The High Council received your quarterly yield report. Ashenmere. Impressive numbers." "Thank you, Eminence." "Impressive," Michael repeated, "and insufficient." He stopped at the edge of the altar, looking down at the spirit in the sphere. "The Vanguard lost the 7th salient last month. The demons pushed through the tertiary barrier and established a forward position in the lower reaches of the spirit realm itself. We are now fighting a war on two fronts with a treasury that your division is failing to fill. My division exceeded its quarterly quota by 400%, Raziel said. And the war consumed that surplus before the ink dried on your ledger. Michael's gaze hadn't moved from the sphere. The light must cleanse the dark, Auditor. That is the mandate. That is the only mandate, and the light requires fuel. I'm aware that light requires fuel, Eminence, Raziel said. They moved to stand on the opposite side of the altar, the spirit between them. That's precisely why I'm here. The fuel is the problem. We've been harvesting faith from living humans for millennia, and the yield curve is flattening. Human populations grow, but their per capita devotion declines. Comfort breeds complacency. Education breeds skepticism. We can engineer suffering to spike the output temporarily, but the baseline is eroding. Then engineer more suffering, Michael said. There are diminishing returns. Push too hard and the population collapses. Dead humans don't pray. Raziel placed their hand on the glass sphere, their fingers resting lightly on the curved surface. But dead humans do leave something behind. Michael looked at Raziel's hand on the sphere. His expression didn't change. It was unclear whether an archangel's expression could change, but the light emanating from his wings dimmed by a barely perceptible degree. What are you proposing? Michael asked. A permanent solution to the energy crisis, Raziel said. One that doesn't depend on the living. You have 48 hours, Michael said. He turned toward the door, his wings expanding to their full, burning span. At the threshold, he paused without turning back. If your solution is what I suspect it is, Auditor, you should know that the High Council's tolerance for innovation is directly proportional to its desperation. We are very desperate. Do not waste that opportunity. He left. The light in the room returned to its normal, directionless equilibrium. The barrier clock resumed its full tempo. Raziel stood at the altar, their hand still resting on the glass sphere. They could feel the spirit inside responding to the warmth of their palm, the faint, irregular pulse quickening slightly, the gray mist pressing against the glass as if seeking contact. 48 hours. That was more than enough. Raziel unsealed the sphere with a twist of celestial script, a precise, three-syllable invocation that dissolved the glass into fine, golden sand. The spirit floated free, hovering above the altar's containment rings, held in place by the geometric script, but no longer confined. It was larger without the glass. The gray luminescence expanded to roughly the size of a human torso, and Raziel could see the internal structure, layered bands of light and shadow that corresponded to the soul's accumulated experiences. Brighter bands were strong memories. Darker bands were trauma, grief, suppressed pain. The brightest point, near what would have been the center of the chest, pulsed with a warm, amber glow, the core identity, the fundamental sense of self that held everything else together. Raziel opened the velvet case on the workbench and selected a scalpel. The instrument was a slender rod of crystallized celestial light, no thicker than a stylus, tapering to a point so fine it was invisible to the naked eye. It was designed for spectral analysis, separating layered energy signatures for examination. Raziel had never used one on a spirit before. Nobody had. That was rather the point. They positioned the scalpel at the outermost band of the spirit's luminescence, a thin, faintly golden layer near the surface. They could hear it. That was the part that surprised them. The memory had a sound. It was quiet, barely audible, like a voice speaking from the bottom of a well. But as Raziel brought the scalpel closer, the sound clarified. It was a woman's voice. She was laughing. Not the performative laughter of social obligation, but the deep, helpless, gasping laughter of someone who had been caught off guard by joy. And beneath the laughter, smaller sounds, a child's voice, high and delighted, saying something Raziel couldn't quite make out. A wooden floor creaking under small, running feet. The clatter of something falling, a cup, maybe, or a wooden toy, and the laughter doubling. The woman and the child feeding each other's delight until the sound became a single, tangled, golden noise that was indistinguishable from happiness. Raziel listened for a moment. Their head tilted slightly, the way it did when they encountered an interesting data point. Then they made the cut. The scalpel passed through the outer band, and the memory separated from the spirit with a sound that Raziel had no reference for, a wet, tearing shriek that wasn't acoustic but metaphysical, a vibration that bypassed the ears entirely and struck the consciousness directly. The spirit convulsed. The gray mist contracted violently, the internal structure destabilizing as the severed band peeled away and dissolved into the air. The energy release was instantaneous. A shockwave of raw, blinding force erupted from the altar, not light nor heat, but something more fundamental, a burst of pure existential trauma converted directly into celestial energy. It hit the containment rings and blew through them. It hit the resonance channels in the walls and overloaded them. The glass lenses on the workbench shattered simultaneously, spraying crystalline fragments across the polished floor. The barrier clock's pendulum stopped mid-swing. The gold and silver inlay in the ceiling flared white-hot, the geometric patterns burning like brands before the channels burned out and went dark. Raziel was thrown backward. Their shoulders hit the workbench, and a shard of broken lens sliced a clean line across their left cheek. Golden ichor, the celestial equivalent of blood, welled from the cut and ran down their jaw in a thin, luminous streak. The laboratory was silent. The instruments were destroyed. The containment rings on the altar were cracked and dark. The spirit hovered above the ruined altar, diminished, its luminescence flickering, the place where the memory had been now a dark, ragged wound in its structure. And suspended in the air between the spirit and the ceiling, a sphere of raw, concentrated energy pulsed with a light so intense that Raziel had to squint. It was not golden like faith. It was white, pure, dense, vibrating at a frequency that made every surface in the room hum. Raziel straightened up. They wiped the ichor from their cheek with the back of their hand, leaving a golden smear across their skin. They did the math. The energy output from a single severed memory was, they ran the calculation twice because the number seemed wrong, approximately 1,000 times the yield of a standard prayer unit. One memory, one cut, 1,000 prayers. A human spirit contained hundreds of memories, if not thousands. The barrier clock's pendulum began to swing again, slowly, resuming its count. Raziel looked at the pulsing white sphere and felt something they hadn't felt since their first successful harvest 3 centuries ago, the pure, electric thrill of a problem solved. Not a temporary fix, not a patch on a declining system, a fundamental breakthrough that changed the shape of what was possible. They picked up the ledger from where it had fallen on the floor, brushed the glass fragments from its cover, and opened it to a blank page. They began to write. Chapter 3, The Golden Hook. The basement of heaven smelled like a foundry. Not the clean, ozone-sharp sterility of the upper tiers. Down here, beneath the administrative substructure, beneath the sealed archive chambers and the resonance relay stations, the air was thick with the hot, metallic tang of overworked machinery and the acrid sweetness of burning feathers. The corridors were narrow, lined with exposed conduit pipes that carried celestial fluid to the barrier maintenance systems, the metal surfaces slick with condensation that collected in slow, fat drops on the stone floor. The light was different too, not the pervasive, directionless illumination of the upper realms, but a harsh, industrial amber thrown by banks of resonance lamps bolted to the ceiling on iron brackets. This was the infrastructure, the mechanical guts of the divine apparatus that kept the barrier between realms intact. It regulated the flow of celestial energy and maintained the dimensional pressure that prevented the spirit realm from bleeding into the living world. It was not beautiful. It was not meant to be seen. The angels who worked down here, maintenance crews, barrier technicians, fluid engineers, were the lowest-ranked members of the celestial hierarchy, and they moved through the corridors with the hunched, purposeful efficiency of workers who understood that their function was essential and their visibility was not. Raziel had commandeered Chamber 17 3 weeks ago. The chamber was a cavernous maintenance bay originally designed for barrier calibration, a vaulted space with reinforced walls and a recessed floor that provided direct access to the underside of the celestial barrier. The barrier itself was visible overhead, a vast, shimmering membrane of compressed light that stretched from wall to wall like the surface of an inverted lake. Through the membrane, the spirit realm was faintly visible, a gray, formless expanse that extended in every direction, featureless and still. Billions of human souls drifted in that gray silence, their faint luminescence creating a diffuse, pale glow that made the underside of the barrier look like a sky full of dying stars. Raziel had spent 3 weeks turning Chamber 17 into something else entirely. The machinery filled the center of the bay. It was enormous, a towering assembly of brass cylinders, iron chain housings, and heavy-gauge winch mechanisms anchored to the reinforced floor with bolts the thickness of a human arm. The central column was a vertical shaft of polished brass 20 feet tall, housing a telescoping deployment arm that could extend downward through a breach in the barrier and into the spirit realm below. At the end of the deployment arm, suspended on a chain of interlocking celestial steel links, hung the hook. It was golden, 3 feet across, curved like a fishhook and inscribed with extraction script, dense, layered celestial notation that would grip a human soul the way a magnet grips iron filings. The script glowed with a steady, pulsing light that reflected off the brass of the machinery and cast shifting, golden patterns across the stone walls. Raziel stood at the base of the machinery, their hands resting on the primary control console, a brass panel studded with actuator levers, pressure gauges, and routing dials. They were not wearing their standard auditor's robes. They had traded them for a heavy, oil-stained work tunic that one of the maintenance crew had left behind. Their sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and there was a streak of machinery grease across the back of their right hand. They looked up at the hook, and they felt something that they recognized with clinical precision as pride. This was the answer. Not a patch, not a temporary spike in yield, not another engineered drought to squeeze a few hundred more units out of a dying population. This was a fundamental restructuring of the celestial energy supply. The living humans could keep their comfortable, faithless lives. The prayers could dwindle. The demons could steal every last farmer in the eastern reaches. None of it would matter, because the real resource had been sitting beneath them the entire time, an ocean of raw spiritual material, inexhaustible, waiting to be processed. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, lighter than Raziel's, faster. Puriel stopped at the entrance to the chamber and stared. "What is this?" Puriel said. Raziel turned from the console. They smiled, warm, genuine, the expression of someone presenting a project they'd poured themselves into. "Come in, I want to show you something." Puriel didn't move from the doorway. Their eyes were fixed on the thinned section of barrier, where the gray of the spirit realm was clearly visible through the weakened membrane. "Auditor, that barrier section is destabilized. If it ruptures..." "It won't rupture. It will open just wide enough." Raziel crossed the chamber toward them, their boots leaving prints in the thin layer of machine oil on the floor. "I've calibrated the breach parameters to maintain structural integrity at the margins. The opening will be precisely controlled, 3 meters in diameter, sealed with containment script, operable on demand." "An opening," Puriel repeated, "into the spirit realm." "Yes." Puriel looked at the hook. The realization assembled itself in their expression, not all at once, but in stages, each component clicking into place. "You're going to reach into the afterlife," Puriel said, "and pull them out." "I'm going to harvest a resource that we've been ignoring for millennia," Raziel said. They gestured at the machinery with an open hand, the way a host gestures at a well-set table. "The spirit realm contains approximately 8 billion dormant human souls. 8 billion. Each one carrying thousands of accumulated memories saturated with emotional charge. In my laboratory, I extracted a single memory from a single soul and generated 1,000 times the yield of a standard prayer unit. One memory." They held up a finger. "The math writes itself, Puriel." "The dead are meant to rest," Puriel said. Their voice had shifted, not louder, but harder, carrying the rigid, clipped cadence of someone quoting from memory. The primordial accord established the boundary as inviolable. The living serve the divine through devotion. The dead return to silence and peace. That is the order. The order was written when we weren't losing a war, Raziel said. The order was written because this, Puriel pointed at the hook, their hand trembling slightly, is exactly the kind of dependency that degrades us. We are celestial beings, Auditor. We are not supposed to be digging through the refuse of human mortality to fuel our furnaces. Faith was already a compromise. This is consumption. Direct, physical, material consumption of human remnants. It makes us no different from the demons who drain the living. Raziel listened. They let Puriel's words hang in the oil-thick air of the chamber, giving them the respect of silence before responding. It was a technique they'd perfected, the pause that made the other person feel heard, even when Raziel had already dismissed everything they'd said. I understand your concern, Raziel said. You believe this represents a further entanglement with human material that diminishes our nature. A purist position, and I respect the theology behind it. They stepped closer to Puriel, their voice dropping into the warm, intimate register they used when they wanted someone to feel like a confidant rather than a subordinate. But consider what I'm actually doing, Puriel. I'm not consuming them. I'm refining them. A human soul sitting in the spirit realm is a decaying collection of mortal memories, grief, regret, confusion, the accumulated noise of a biological life. It serves no purpose. It degrades over centuries until it dissolves into the void. That is a waste. They turned and walked back toward the machinery, their hand trailing along the polished brass of the central column. What I am offering is salvation. I take that decaying material and I strip away the noise, the mortal attachments, the biological residue, the identity that served its purpose and is now simply rotting. What remains is pure energy, clean, permanent, immortal, and I seal that energy into divine armor, giving it a form and a function that the original human could never have achieved. They looked back at Puriel. I am not desecrating the dead, scribe. I am ascending them. Puriel stared at Raziel. The conflict in their expression was visible, not the compassionate horror of a being who felt the suffering, but the rigid, grinding discomfort of a being whose foundational principles were being reframed in language they couldn't easily reject. The accord, Puriel began. The accord was a policy decision, not a divine law, Raziel said, and policies change when circumstances demand it. The Archangel Michael has given me 48 hours to demonstrate a solution to the energy crisis. I intend to be successful. They turned back to the console and placed their hands on the actuator levers. You're welcome to stay and observe, or you'll leave and file a formal objection with the scribe's office. Either way, the breach opens in 3 minutes. Puriel didn't leave. They didn't approach either. They stood at the entrance to the chamber, their arms folded tightly across their chest, their parchment forgotten on the floor. Raziel pulled the primary lever. The machinery engaged with a deep, grinding roar that filled the chamber and vibrated through the stone floor. The chain housing began to turn, massive iron gears interlocking with a heavy, rhythmic clunking that sounded like the heartbeat of something vast and mechanical. The golden hook descended from its resting position, swinging gently on the chain as the deployment arm telescoped downward toward the thinned section of barrier. Raziel adjusted the breach parameters on the console. The containment script around the weakened membrane flared, the golden notation brightening to a blinding intensity as the barrier began to open. It didn't tear. It folded. The membrane separated along the containment lines with a sound like heavy silk being drawn apart, a smooth, liquid whisper that was immediately swallowed by the mechanical roar of the winches. Through the opening, the spirit realm became fully visible, a vast, gray ocean of diffuse light, stretching in every direction, featureless and silent. The hook dropped through the breach. The golden chain unspooled from the housing in a deafening cascade of metal links, the hook descending into the gray at speed. Raziel watched it through the breach, a bright, pulsing point of gold sinking into the pale, formless expanse like a fishing lure dropped into still water. It plunged deep. The chain kept unspooling, 50 feet, 100, 200. The hook passed through the upper layers of the spirit realm, where the most recently dead drifted in loose, scattered clusters. It continued down into the denser strata, where older souls had settled into the compressed gray of deep dormancy. The extraction script activated. The golden inscription on the hook flared, sending out a pulse of targeted celestial energy that swept through the surrounding gray in an expanding ring. The pulse was calibrated to lock onto the nearest soul with sufficient density to be viable for processing. The chain jerked. The winch mechanisms screamed, a high, metallic shriek of stressed iron as the chain snapped taut. Something was on the hook. Something was fighting. Raziel gripped the console and engaged the retrieval sequence. The winches reversed, the gears grinding, the chain beginning its slow, agonizing ascent back through the breach. The links were vibrating with the strain, each one ringing against the next with a chiming, percussive rhythm that filled the chamber. Through the breach, Raziel could see it rising, a bright, thrashing point of gray luminescence being dragged upward through the strata, leaving a turbulent wake in the formless gray. The soul was fighting the hook with everything it had, its luminescence flaring and dimming in violent, irregular pulses. The chain pulled it through the breach. The soul emerged into the chamber in a burst of gray light that momentarily dimmed the resonance lamps. It was larger than the specimen from the laboratory, a dense, fully coherent human spirit, its internal structure visible as layered bands of memory and identity, pulsing with frantic, desperate energy. It thrashed against the hook, the extraction script holding it in place, while the rest of its form writhed and contorted. It was screaming. The sound was not acoustic. It was the same metaphysical vibration Raziel had felt during the laboratory experiment, but amplified 100-fold. A raw, shearing wail of terror and confusion that bypassed the ears and struck the consciousness directly. Puriel pressed their hands against the sides of their head, their face contorting. Raziel didn't flinch. They had prepared for this. They moved to the secondary console, a separate panel positioned beside a heavy, cylindrical apparatus that Raziel had assembled from modified barrier maintenance equipment. The apparatus was a forge. A vertical column of concentrated holy fire contained within rings of compression script, burning at a temperature that existed outside the human concept of heat. "Containment transfer," Raziel said, their voice cutting through the spirit's screaming. They engaged the routing mechanism, and the golden hook swung on its chain, carrying the thrashing soul toward the forge's intake aperture. The spirit passed through the containment rings and into the fire. The scream changed. It deepened, lengthened, became something that Raziel could feel in the marrow of their celestial bones. The holy fire did not burn the soul. It burned everything the soul was. Raziel watched through the forge's observation window as the layered bands of memory ignited one by one. A childhood, a first love, a daughter's wedding, the taste of bread on a winter morning, the sound of rain on a tin roof. Each memory flared white-hot as it was incinerated, the emotional charge converting into raw, concentrated energy that the forge absorbed and redirected into the output channels. The identity went last. The bright, amber core, the fundamental sense of self, resisted the fire longer than anything else. It pulsed, contracted, expanded, pulsed again. Then it fractured. The amber light shattered into fragments that dissolved into the white heat, and what remained was no longer a person. It was a hollow vessel of compressed rage, the distilled, purified residue of a consciousness that had been stripped of everything except the anguish of its own erasure. Raziel redirected the output into the final stage. At the base of the forge, a suit of armor stood in an iron frame. It was golden, polished celestial steel shaped into the form of a human body, featureless, the faceplate smooth and blank. The purified energy flowed into the armor through the forge's output channels, filling the hollow interior with a dense, pulsing white light. The armor shuddered. The gauntlets clenched. The boots pressed flat against the stone floor. The blank faceplate tilted upward, and from behind the smooth, golden surface, 2 points of light ignited, harsh, white, devoid of recognition or personality or anything resembling thought. The iron frame released. The conscript stepped forward. It moved the way Raziel moved, precise, balanced, economical. But there was nothing behind the movement. No intention, no curiosity, no awareness. It was a mechanism wearing the shape of a person, powered by the compressed agony of someone who no longer existed. The conscript stood in the center of the chamber, its blank white eyes fixed on nothing. The golden armor reflected the amber light of the resonance lamps. The forge behind it cooled, the holy fire dimming. The spirit's screaming had stopped. The chamber was quiet except for the slow, heavy ticking of the machinery settling into standby. Raziel walked a slow circle around the conscript, examining it. They checked the armor's joints, the energy saturation readings on the containment script, and the stability of the output charge. Everything was within parameters. The conscript was functional, durable, and combat-ready. They looked at Puriel. The scribe was still standing at the entrance. Their hands had dropped from their head. Their face was pale, a celestial pallor that went beyond the normal luminescence of their skin into something bloodless and rigid. They were staring at the conscript, trying to process something their frame of reference had no category for. "It works," Raziel said. Their voice was quiet, but it carried easily in the silent chamber. "One soul, one conscript, combat-ready in under 4 minutes, and there are 8 billion more where that came from." "What have you built?" Puriel whispered. Raziel smiled. It was the same warm, brilliant smile from the observation terrace, the same smile from the laboratory, the smile of a professional who had just solved a problem that everyone else said was impossible. "I've built the future," Raziel said. They turned back to the console and began writing the deployment specifications for a full-scale production model. I hope you are enjoying this story so far. Stay tuned next week for part 2 of this story. Don't forget to like and subscribe and to check out our Patreon page. If you are watching on Patreon, I really appreciate your support. Chapter 4: The Empty Heaven. The Grand Apex existed outside the architecture of the tiers. There was no corridor leading to it, no staircase, no transit passage. Raziel simply walked through a doorway on the uppermost level of the administrative substructure, and the space changed. The walls dissolved. The ceiling vanished. The floor became water, a vast, perfectly still expanse of reflective liquid that extended in every direction to a horizon that didn't exist. The water was warm beneath Raziel's boots, ankle-deep, and so clear that the surface was indistinguishable from the air above it. Every step sent a ripple outward that traveled forever and never returned. The light was annihilating. Not the directionless illumination of the lower tiers, not the industrial amber of the basement, but a concentrated, absolute radiance that came from everywhere and nowhere, and pressed against Raziel's skin with the physical weight of deep water. It was not warm. It was not cold. It was simply present, the way gravity is present, an inescapable condition of the space that made every surface, every edge, every fold of fabric glow with a brilliance that threatened to dissolve the boundary between the self and the light. Raziel walked across the water toward the center of the apex, each step sending slow, concentric rings across the surface. Behind them, the conscript followed. Its golden boots broke the water with a heavier, mechanical rhythm. They reached the center. Raziel knelt. The water soaked through the knees of their robes. They folded their hands in their lap and bowed their head. Behind them, the conscript stood motionless, its white eyes burning steadily in the golden faceplate. The silence was absolute. It pressed against the inside of Raziel's skull. It made thoughts feel slower, heavier, as if the apex itself was reading them before they fully formed. Then the voices began. They didn't come from a direction. They came from the light. Overlapping, layered, harmonizing, and dissonating simultaneously, dozens of voices speaking in unison, each one pitched at a slightly different register, creating a sound that was not a chord but a pressure. The words were intelligible, but the meaning arrived before the language, as if understanding was being pressed directly into the listener's mind. Auditor Raziel, 3rd tier, Division of Sustenance. Raziel inclined their head deeper. Eminences. You bring an unknown construct into the apex. Identify IT. A prototype eminences, Raziel said. Their voice sounded thin in the vastness, a single instrument against an orchestra. A celestial conscript, combat-ready infantry unit powered by refined spiritual energy. The silence returned. It lasted long enough for Raziel to begin to sweat. Spiritual energy, the voices said. The harmonics shifted, the higher registers dropping out, leaving a deeper, more resonant tone that vibrated through the water beneath Raziel's knees. Define the source. Human souls, Raziel said. Harvested from the spirit realm, processed through a celestial forge, and sealed into standardized armor. The identity and memory content of the soul is incinerated during processing, converting the emotional charge into a stable, high-density power source. The resulting unit is autonomous, durable, and requires no ongoing faith capital to maintain. The silence fell again, longer this time. The water beneath Raziel's knees vibrated faintly, as if something enormous was moving beneath the surface. This is profanity. A single voice separated from the chorus, higher, sharper, carrying a cutting authority that made Raziel's jaw clench involuntarily. The spirit realm is consecrated ground. The dead are under the protection of the primordial accord. You have violated the foundational. With respect, SERAPHIEL, another voice cut in, lower and colder. Let the auditor finish. The sharp voice fell silent. The layered chorus resumed, the registers rebalancing. Continue, auditor. Raziel lifted their head. They couldn't see the speakers, the light was too absolute, the source too diffuse. The archangels of the High Council were not visible presences. They were the light. They were the water. They were the silence between the words. Eminences, Raziel said, I understand that the conscript represents a departure from established doctrine. I do not bring it before you lightly. They reached into the folds of their robe and produced their ledger. They opened it and held it up, letting the pages face the light. The current state of the war, Raziel said. In the last quarter alone, the demon advance has consumed 3 salient positions. The vanguard has requested emergency capital allocations 4 times. The human faith output is declining at an annual rate of 6% due to demographic shifts in the mortal population, urbanization, education, the natural erosion of devotional behavior that accompanies material comfort. They turned a page. The celestial armories are operating at 14% capacity. The vanguard is fielding units with degraded equipment and insufficient energy reserves. At the current rate of decline, our defensive perimeter in the lower spirit realm will collapse within 8 decades. Within 120 years, the demons will hold a controlling position over the barrier itself. They closed the ledger. The faith capital model is a declining asset. It was designed for an era when human populations were small, desperate, and devout. That era is ending. We can engineer suffering to temporarily spike the output, but the baseline will continue to fall. Within 2 centuries, we will be bankrupt. The water was still, the light pressed. You can maintain the primordial accord, Raziel said. Their voice had steadied. The thin, deferential tone was gone, replaced by the warm, confident register they used when they gained momentum. You can preserve the sanctity of the spirit realm and allow 8 billion souls to decay into useless gray silence while the demons eat our territory year by year. You can lose this war with your principles intact. Or, Raziel said, you can authorize the deployment of the technology I have built. 1 conscript per soul, 1 soul per 4 minutes of processing. I can build a production facility capable of generating 10,000 conscripts per day. Within a year, we will have an army larger than anything the demons have ever fielded. Within 5 years, we will push them back to their origin point. Within a decade, we will eradicate them. They held the ledger against their chest. Do not speak to me of laws, eminences, when we are facing extinction. The silence that followed was the longest yet. Raziel knelt in the water, their ledger pressed to their chest, the conscript standing behind them with its blank eyes burning. The light pressed against their skin. The water was perfectly still. When the chorus spoke again, the harmonics had changed. The outrage was gone. The sharp, cutting tone of Seraphil had been absorbed into the collective register, smoothed and blended until it was indistinguishable from the rest. What remained was something quieter and far more terrifying, the measured, deliberate tone of a governing body that had made a decision and was now framing it for the record. The High Council recognizes the strategic merit of the auditor's proposal. Raziel's fingers tightened on the ledger. The primordial accord governing the spirit realm is hereby suspended for the duration of the current conflict. Harvesting operations will proceed under the direct authority of a newly created office. The light in the apex shifted. It concentrated, narrowing from its omnidirectional diffusion into a focused column that descended from above and struck the water directly in front of Raziel. The surface erupted into a ring of outward-moving ripples, and from the column of light, something materialized, a golden sigil, rotating slowly, inscribed with a title in celestial script. Auditor Raziel is hereby elevated to the rank of architect. The office of the Architect of Grace is established with full authority over spirit realm extraction, conscript production, and deployment logistics. The sigil descended and pressed itself against Raziel's sternum, directly over the old classification emblem. The golden thread burned through the fabric, replacing the third-tier auditor's mark with something larger, more complex, radiating a warmth that spread through Raziel's chest like swallowed sunlight. "Architect," the chorus said, "begin." Raziel stood. The water streamed from their robes. They pressed their hand against the new sigil on their chest, feeling the heat of it through their palm. Behind them, the conscript stood at attention, its blank eyes reflecting the infinite light of the apex. "Thank you, eminences," Raziel said. They turned and walked back across the water. The conscript followed, its heavy boots striking the surface in that flat, mechanical rhythm. The doorway materialized ahead of them, the threshold between the apex and the administrative corridor, between the absolute and the mundane. Raziel stepped through. The corridor was dim after the apex. Raziel blinked, their vision adjusting to the standard illumination of the upper tiers. The conscript emerged behind them and stopped, standing motionless against the wall, awaiting instruction. Raziel walked. They reached Chamber 17. Puriel was standing inside, exactly where Raziel had left them 3 hours ago. The scribe hadn't moved. They were standing at the entrance to the chamber, their arms still folded across their chest, their eyes fixed on the machinery. But the chamber had changed, while Raziel was in the apex. The production crews had arrived. 16 maintenance engineers, reassigned from barrier calibration duty, were working across the bay, assembling additional forge units, mounting new chain housings. The single golden hook had been joined by 9 more, arranged in a row along the deployment arm, each one inscribed with extraction script and gleaming in the amber light. The breach in the barrier had been widened and reinforced, the containment rings glowing steadily. And at the far end of the chamber, a long rack of empty golden armor stood in iron frames. 50 suits, polished and featureless, their blank faceplates reflecting the work lights. Waiting. Raziel walked past Puriel without stopping. The scribe turned to watch them go. Their face was the same rigid, bloodless pallor it had been during the first conscript's forging, but their eyes had changed. The professional composure, the dutiful neutrality, the careful blankness of a junior clerk, all of it was gone. What remained was something older and harder, the look of a being who had watched the line they believed in get erased. Raziel reached the primary console. It was larger now, expanded to accommodate the additional hooks and forge units, the brass panel bristling with actuator levers, one for each hook in the row. Tomorrow there will be 100. Next week, 1,000. They placed their hand on the first lever. The new sigil on their chest pulsed with a warm, golden light. "Let the harvest begin," Raziel said. 10 golden hooks dropped through the breach in a cascade of screaming metal, plunging into the gray silence of the spirit realm. The chamber filled with the deafening, grinding roar of industrial-scale extraction. Raziel pulled the remaining levers. The sound doubled, tripled. The floor shook. The resonance lamps flickered. Through the breach, the gray of the spirit realm churned, the pale, diffuse light of billions of dormant souls rippling outward from the impact points of 10 golden hooks dragging the dead out of their rest. The first chain began to rise. A soul emerged through the breach, thrashing, screaming the soundless scream. Puriel stood at the entrance and watched. The second chain rose. The third. The machinery found its rhythm, a grinding, mechanical heartbeat that would not stop, that was designed never to stop, that would run day and night for as long as the war lasted and the dead remained. Raziel stood at the console with their hand on the levers and their new title burning against their chest. And they watched the golden chains haul the dead into the light, and they smiled because it was beautiful. The gates of heaven opened, not to welcome the dead, but to drag them screaming into service. The harvest had begun. Quote of the week: religion is regarded by the common people as true, by the wise as false, and by rulers as useful. Edward Gibbon. Thank you for listening to Celestial War Series, Part 1. Hope you enjoyed this story. If you want to hear more, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check us out on Patreon. New stories are uploaded on Patreon every Friday and on YouTube every Monday.